do I need? Does it need to be refrigerated? Does it not? Here's a rule of thumb. If your probiotic has to be refrigerated, it's not a good probiotic, because you're going to refrigerate it and take good care of it, but then it's going to hit the acid in your stomach and it's going to die.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Reshape Your Health podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Morgan Nolte, and this is part 2 with Ashlee Symcox, and she's a registered nurse and functional nutritional therapy practitioner. She's also one of our Zivli members. If you're a member and you're active in office hours, you've probably met her. Maybe she's given you some advice before, and I was so impressed with the advice that she gave related to medications and gut health that I invited her on the podcast to share it with a broader audience. And so last week, if you haven't listened to part 1, we talked about certain medications and how specifically statins, blood pressure, and blood glucose medications can impact insulin, inflammation, weight loss. And so today, what we're going to talk about are antibiotics and gut health. So we kind of wrapped up last week's conversation on antibiotics, and we were going to dive into more specifics on gut health, which isn't something that I talk about a ton because I don't have a lot of training in there. I mean, it's in a lot of the different resources that I read. You're hearing more and more about it. There's a few like top books on my list that I'd like to read about gut health, but let's just start first off, Ashlee, with an overview of the gut, like upper versus lower GI. And then when people kind of have a good context of like, well, what is my gut and what are people talking about when they're talking about gut health, we can segue into then how do antibiotics affect the gut?
Great. And thank you again for having me back on. It's an honor to be here.
I
love the way you asked that. Yes, thank you. I love the way you asked that question, because I think when people think of the gut, they're thinking of like one thing, like my gut. You hear gut health kind of thrown around in this health space quite a bit. And there's actually a little bit of clarification that's needed there. So you have your upper GI and then you have your lower GI. Functional nutrition, we talk about a north to south approach. And so that kind of divides up the gut. So we want to think of the gut in terms of like the north approach and the south approach. So your upper GI, or your more northern parts of your gut or GI tract, includes the stomach, the esophagus, the liver and the gallbladder, and all of that first initial part of food coming in. Then the part that most people refer to as the gut or the microbiome includes going even more southern, and that's going to be your small intestine and your large intestine. So it's a little bit more than just, oh, I need to take a probiotic for my gut. There's a lot of things that the upper GI part needs to be addressed, that need to be addressed with the upper GI as well as the lower GI. So it is a little bit more than just the gut. There's a lot of things that happen in all different aspects of the gut, and I can break those down if you would like. Or
I love that. Yes, I would love that.
Perfect. So when we think of gut health and antibiotics in general, we talk about, okay, when you take an antibiotic, it will kill all of those microorganisms. So in the gut, you have a healthy commensal population of bacteria, which include good guys and bad guys, if you want to make it easy. And so the problem is when you take antibiotics, they wipe out like all of those. They're going to kill what's causing the infection, but they're also going to kill some of those good guys. And that all happens in the lower, the large intestine. That's going to be where we have all of this bacteria happening and doing all kinds of things. And so what ends up happening is that the now that you've taken the antibiotic and the bad guys have been killed, but the good guys have too, now you have this environment for what we call opportunistic infections. And an opportunistic infection is something like a candida or yeast overgrowth, because we've killed the good guys that keep yeast in balance. And so in the gut, you do need candida or yeast, but not in large amounts. And so when something that need to be kept in check, an organism that needs to be kept in check becomes increased, that's called an opportunistic infection. And so antibiotics really lead to this. That's why a lot of people after a round of antibiotics will see that they have like a yeast infection or need some sort of support for yeast or candida. And that all happens in the lowermost part. That's our colon, our large intestine. That's where the microbiome is. But if we start from the top, we have to really look at what's going on to get to where something like an opportunistic infection is taking place. Even before antibiotics, there's opportunistic infections that happen for other reasons like stress, diet, sugar, high sugar diet, pharmaceuticals, things like that. So if we want to just kind of start from the top and go down, it starts at when you eat your food and you're mechanically digesting your food. You have the digestive enzymes, specifically amylase, in your mouth that starts breaking down carbohydrates when you eat. So you're digesting a carbohydrate before you even swallow it in the mouth. And then as you swallow your food, it goes down the esophagus and lands in the stomach. In between the stomach and the esophagus is what we call the lower esophageal sphincter. We call that LES for short. And it's actually really important to understand the lower esophageal sphincter because this is when problems arise. When you eat food, the lower esophageal sphincter will open, allowing food to go through and into the stomach. And it's supposed to close back up. However, when there's poor stomach acid, poor digestive enzymes, the lower esophageal sphincter does not close back up. It stays open. And then stomach acid, hydrochloric acid, which is usually a pH of about 1.5 to 2, so really acidic, will start to travel up into the esophagus. And so when that happens, we have issues like GERD, acid reflux, different kind of digestive issues occur that way. If you don't have enough stomach acid, you are going to have undigested food in your stomach. Then that undigested food is going to go through your small intestine and your large intestine. It's going to be sitting in the gut, undigested. And what happens is protein putrefies, carbohydrates ferment, and fat becomes rancid. And so this right here, just by not addressing digestion, making sure that we can get into the ways to support that. But when you have poor digestion or poor stomach acid, now you've got an environment in your microbiome that opportunistic infections are feeding off of the food you didn't get to digest because your body didn't digest it. And so now we have an overgrowth of all of these infections, all of these bugs that cause issues. And now we have a need for antibiotics. And then the cycle just keeps repeating itself, but we didn't start from the north and make our way to the south. Does that make sense?
I think that it makes sense, especially from a more novice approach like myself approaching gut health. You hear a lot about probiotics.
Yeah.
And it sounds like that's a downstream solution and we need to kind of start upstream north. So let's talk about ways that we can improve the digestion of our food before we even get to the colon where the probiotics are beneficial.
Right. Yes. And this is the thing too. You'll notice if people take a probiotic and they didn't address digestion and things like that, that it's almost like an atomic bomb goes off in the body. There can be detox reactions or people can just feel really crummy. And it's like, oh, but you didn't address kind of the more northern approach first. So there's a systematic approach to really addressing gut health. And so the first thing that you want to do above anything else is eat in a parasympathetic state. So the most northern part of digestion that you can get is actually the nervous system. Because when we eat in fight or flight, so the difference between fight or flight and rest and digest is that when you're in fight or flight, whether you're stressed out or your body's chronically ill, your body is going to be more concerned with that stress than it is going to be digesting food. It's not going to be releasing digestive enzymes. It's not going to be increasing peristalsis, which is the rhythm-like movements of the GI tract to help expel your waste. It's going to be, we're fighting the tiger and we have a lot of stress hormones going on. So the absolute first thing that you need to do to support digestion is help get your body into the parasympathetic or rest and digest state. And what you can do is simply take a few deep breaths before you start a meal. You can maybe meditate before you start a meal. You can eat in an environment that brings you peace and solace. Those things are going to be the first, like before we even talk about just the gut in general, is like, what is the state of your nervous system before you eat a meal? The second thing is mechanically digestion. So mechanical means just chewing your food well. Like most of us maybe chew our food 4 or 5 times and then we swallow.
Yes.
We can take such a load off of that by digesting mechanically by chewing our food, sometimes up to 15 to 30 times. I know people look at me like I have horns when I say that, but the more you can mechanically digest your food, the less your gut is going to have to do. And so now when we talk about the stomach and going back to that lower esophageal sphincter, ideally you have a pH of about 2, which is very acidic in your stomach because your stomach is producing, the parietal cells in your gastric lining produce hydrochloric acid. And that keeps the stomach in an acidic state. So that way the food that you eat gets broken down, the nutrients in your food become assimilated. It also stimulates the increase of digestive enzymes. So enzymes that are going to break down the food that you eat even more. And it also causes the gallbladder to say, wow, we need to release some bile to digest this fat. And so the problem is that most people don't have good stomach acid. Our culture is big on let's get the acid down, but we need to kind of flip that, because without good stomach acid, we don't have this chain of events that happens to properly digest our food. So this is when taking antacids chronically can become a problem, because we've dampened the HCl, and people just aren't digesting their food. And now we have a whole host of those lower downstream effect issues, such as opportunistic infections, putrefying food in the gut. And this also leads to like histamine intolerances. So it's not just in the gut. The gut is central to the immune response that's also going to happen in the rest of the body. And so what we really have to do to optimize that is get stomach acid higher. That's the first step. We can do apple cider vinegar before meals. That's also great for blood sugar regulation. You can do lemon water in the morning, or you can supplement with things. In my practice, I use a lot of betaine, or betaine is basically hydrochloric acid, or digestive enzymes. You can also do liver support, bile salts to help thin the bile, to get the bile to where it's more easily released to digest fats. Oh, did you have a question?
I have lots, but I'm gonna wait. I'm gonna try to wait. I have so many. I want to try to wait and have you explain this top to bottom approach, and then I'm going to go back and do a top to bottom question. So, okay. So you're on bile salts, and that you can use bile salts to thin it.
Yeah.
So keep going from there.
Which optimizes fat digestion. A lot of people, when they have bloating or they're really uncomfortable after a meal, a lot of the times that's because their bile flow is just not optimal, and they're not able to digest the fats that they eat. And so sometimes it's not even about, oh, I need a probiotic. It's about, let's fix the fact that you're just not digesting fats, and that's what's making you feel really crummy. And in functional nutrition, we talk about it's not you are what you eat, it's what you are what you digest. And so some people are eating super healthy meals, but their digestion is just off, maybe because of stress or low stomach acid, whatever it may be. And so, so that just goes into play the importance of fat digestion. That's a big part of it. And then we go into the small intestine. So the small intestine, is specifically in the duodenum, is where you're going to assimilate a lot of nutrients. So that's where we really want to absorb the nutrients from the food that we eat. Sometimes when there's the microbiome imbalance, or those opportunistic infections, like I talked about, the bacteria travels up into the small intestine, and that's not where we want bacteria. There's not supposed to be bacteria in the small intestine. So it's to live in the large intestine, so even more further south. And when this happens, it's called small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or SIBO. Mm-hmm. And SIBO is really a rough thing to have, because you're going to have all kinds of bloating. You're going to have all these microorganisms that are munching down on the food that you're trying to digest, and it just causes a lot of bloating and inflammation, and it's really hard to get rid of. So you can see, as we're talking from that north to south approach, that if we had the optimal stomach acid, we had the optimal digestive enzymes, we had the optimal gallbladder function, we would then the food would then get to the small intestine and perhaps not be such an issue. But because it's mostly undigested in states of not having good digestion, now we have these infections going on in the small intestine, which is where we don't want to have the bacteria. And then the food makes its way through the large intestine, or the colon, and then is expelled. And so that's kind of, the real quick overview of digestion and gut health, and kind of what's going on. And then some of the issues that can happen can be, those opportunistic infections. I talked a little bit about candida or yeast, but there's also parasitic infections. People like to think that in the United States, we don't have an issue with parasites, but one quick look in PubMed, you can see that parasitic infections are actually quite prevalent. In the United States, we can get them from walking barefoot, from eating sushi, from drinking contaminated tap water. So a lot of times when all of that kind of stress of the nervous system and GI system is going on, the body can't properly deal with perhaps a parasitic infection. And so those proliferate and cause more issues. And so and then there's also H. pylori, which is a bacteria that's caused typically when there's that low stomach acid, because if the stomach acid was where it should be, it would be able to kill the H. pylori. But unfortunately, that the lack of stomach acid creates an environment in the stomach for H. pylori to thrive and grow and cause problems that can lead to gastric ulcers. And so it's really important that we understand that if we're going to approach gut health with a probiotic or a parasite cleanse or something like that, we have to start from the north to the south and understand what's really happening in the gut to be able to approach it in the right systematic approach, in a systematic approach to do it right.
So what I heard there was maybe checking my email while I ate breakfast this morning was not a good idea.
Yes, I know.
Yeah, but that's a huge takeaway. I know when I was working in the physical therapy rehab center, some people would take a lunch break. That's not my deal. I'm not a chit chatter.
Yeah.
I just like to get my work done and go home. And so I'd always eat and like work. And I didn't really realize, the damage that was doing until you really just explained it, that digestion really starts in the nervous system. So I'm going to try to kind of go back and review what you said, and then kind of dig a little bit deeper, ask some questions, because that was a really wonderful, beautifully explained overview of how digestion works. So ways that we can stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system when eating. Off the top of my head, get off a device, right? Like be present to your food, be mindful, chew your food. I was going to ask you, I know that, I hope it's okay, but that I'm sharing this, but I know that you have a new son, and I was wondering if you had like checked how many times you chewed your food before you had him and after, because I know with 2 young kids, like it's rare if Justin and I are not getting up like 5 times during a meal. Even if we try to set the table and get the milk and get the spoon and the fork and all the things that they might need, something comes up and I'm like, this is not relaxing. Family meals are not relaxing right now. With a 2 and a 4-year-old. And I really have to consciously think about my food. And it's like, man, we work so hard to prepare nutritious meals. Take the time to enjoy it. So, my grandma, I think my grandma likes to put her fork down between each bite. So that's like a little thing that do you have any other like tips to help me and others relax when we eat?
Yes. And I feel like you might be a fly on the wall in my house, because never have I ever had such an issue with practicing what I preach when it comes to eating in a restful state to properly digest and assimilate my food than with having a new baby. And it's almost like, I don't know if your kids do this, but it's like he knows whenever my food is ready, because that's when he needs me. It's like clockwork. I'm like, did you know my food was ready? Could you sleep a little bit longer? But some other tips that I like to share, obviously, yes, being taking a few moments to center yourself, to take some deep breaths before your meal, to have gratitude for your meal. Gratitude will shift you into the parasympathetic real quick. Maybe you're eating your meal somewhere that you love. I love my patio. My patio is my place where it's peaceful to me. I love to go out there and sit. Maybe you eat your meals there. Maybe you make a rule today and set the intention that you're just not going to bring your food into your office. And, that can be really hard for those of us that are really high capacity workers, and we have a lot of demand on us, and it can be so easy to just consolidate and eat while you're working. But again, it's going to downregulate how your body deals with the food that you're eating. Some other things that you can do is have an accountability partner or have a reminder on your phone. And then a big thing is just really actually taking the time to listen to this podcast and learn, how your digestion actually works. I think most people just don't know. It's almost like in our society, a great thing when you can knock out a bunch of things at once. And so now that just keeping that in the back of your mind that, okay, I'm going to do whatever I can. I know if I have a kid or a busy job, I'm still going to just try to at least take about 15 seconds and breathe, have gratitude. And then that may be all you can do, and that may work.
Yeah. It's funny because you mentioned, you're like, I don't know about you, but where your child started like needing you right when you sat down to eat. Ours is like falling asleep, like for whatever reason, for about the last 4 years. Better now recently. But it was like every time that Justin and I would just fall asleep, someone would start crying. So they had like some ESP across the hallway about like, oh, you're asleep now, let's wake him up.
Yes.
Oh, okay. So really, really interesting information here. I'm thinking about a couple of things. If you're a Zivli member and you're familiar with what action items are, like Ashlee just gave me a lot of great action items that would be applicable to me, such as don't eat in the office. So I think I've been kind of loosely working on that. But that could be something that I make a stronger commitment to.
Yeah.
And then also chewing my food. My kids aren't with me when I'm eating 1 to 2 meals of the day, and I'm still in the habit of not chewing my food.
Yeah.
So I love that. And then moving our way down, what about that lower esophageal sphincter, that LES? Is there anything that we can do to improve that?
Yeah. Yeah. Something that's really simple is just making sure that when you're eating, you're setting up. I think having the baby has been the first time ever I've been eating laying down, because you eat when you can when you're a new mom. And yeah, and I've noticed, oh my goodness, this is actually a big deal, because you have to let gravity help you digest. Okay. Gravity is a part of it. So if you're usually hanging out on the couch or laying in bed eating, you have to realize that your food is going more horizontal than it is vertical. And so let gravity help you eat sitting up. That's going to be huge to help with the backup that can happen as the food is trying to travel down from the esophagus into the stomach through that LES. And so when you're eating laying down and food is slowly traveling through, the LES just stays open because it can sense that there's more that needs to come through.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's going to be really helpful for the LES. And again, going back to chewing, of course, you have your food is at a thinner consistency the more you chew. The LES is like, okay, I'm going to open, but I'm going to close back up. But the other thing too is to make sure you have good stomach acid, because the reason why the LES stays open is if there's undigested food sitting in the stomach because you don't have good stomach acid and you don't have good digestive enzymes, that undigested food is sitting there and it's pushing up on the LES. Yeah. And so when the LES is getting all this undigested food pushing up on it, it's going to open. And that is when the acid is going to travel through. Now, remember, it's not that you have too much acid. You probably have low acid when this is happening, but it's that the stomach has a protective environment from the acid, so you don't feel it, but the esophagus does not. So when the LES is open and acid is traveling up, even though it's not as much acid as you need, you're still going to feel heartburn. You're going to have GERD. You're going to have acid reflux. You're going to feel that because the esophageal sphincter is open. So it's not about taking an antacid. It's about how can we get the LES to close so that the acid doesn't go where it's not supposed to go, which is in the esophagus. And now I feel it. It needs to stay in the stomach.
Okay, this is a very novice question. Why are there certain foods that cause heartburn? Like some people have a sensitivity to spicy foods, for example. Why do those cause heartburn?
Yeah, it's because of the exact same thing that we're talking about. The lower esophageal sphincter is malfunctioning. And so, I don't know how to explain it very well, but if you were to take that spicy food and just kind of put it on your skin, I don't know, you're going to probably have some irritation, like cayenne pepper or something. Like very irritating.
Jalapenos, like when I'm making jalapeno poppers and it gets under my fingernail because I'm dumb and I didn't wear a glove or a spoon to scoop it out. I will not make that mistake again.
Yeah. Yes. Or even onions too. Think about what onions are doing to your eyes. I mean, a lot of foods are irritating to the lining or the mucosa of the stomach and then the lining of the esophagus. And so if you're eating those spicy foods, and doctors, I think, will tell you, like, limit those spicy, caffeine, all those things that are irritants to the stomach, it's because those are more than likely traveling back up through the lower esophageal sphincter. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have a food sensitivity or you're allergic to that food. It's that your GI tract is not operating functionally to where those spices are kind of now hanging out in your esophagus, or that, I think caffeine is another big one that people really say they struggle with GI issues.
Interesting.
And so, yeah, it's all the same thing. Go back and close up that lower esophageal sphincter, sit up when you're eating. Let's get the food digesting, and those things should get better. A lot of my clients get off of their antacids because we fix the issue, which the best thing you can really do is get the pH back up to like a 2, 1.5, which is really acidic.
Okay, so if stomach acid, having a pH of about 2 is really important. How can we increase the acidity of our stomach? You mentioned a couple of things that I'll try to remember. You said like lemon water and apple cider vinegar prior to a meal. Is there a certain time frame for which we should have that before we eat?
Yeah, I think the best thing with apple cider vinegar is to do it first thing in the morning before anything's hit your stomach. That really stimulates the secretion of your own gastric juices or hydrochloric acid. And so that can be really helpful. And then you can implement it like maybe 20, 15 minutes before a meal. Typically, you really only need to do apple cider vinegar once a day if you're kind of in that minimal. The thing with these generalized recommendations is some people have pretty severe acid issues and some people don't. So with somebody who's just like, I've got some minor issues, that's somebody who would be great for the apple cider vinegar. And it just depends on how often you need it. So if you're if in the morning, a glass of warm water with apple cider vinegar, and I like to put lemon in it. I like to just throw it all together, but some people can't, like that's just too many flavors for some people. If that just one a day in the morning before anything else hits your stomach works for you and you're digesting better, stick with it. If you need to do it more times during the day, you can work on that. And I would say 15 to 20 minutes before a meal.
Okay, love that. I just revealed in office hours, I was like, I'm giving up coffee again. And I'm just trying it for a week, but I love that as an action item for me because I don't want to wake Leah up. She's an early riser like I am. And so I didn't want to like use my microwave and all that. But I love the idea of improving my digestive function with the lemon and the apple cider vinegar. Is it like a tablespoon or how much?
I'm the worst at measurements, but yes, most people recommend like 2 tablespoons with the water and then just like a squeeze of a lemon. I like to buy lemon juice and I just kind of throw it in there how I like. I'm terrible at measurements, but you can do 2 tablespoons is what people mostly recommend.
Anywho, that's a lovely action item for me because I want to replace the coffee habit with something that's not as caffeinated. Then maybe that would be a nice replacement. Still give me kind of that oral fixation and something warm to have in the morning. Okay. So anything else on improving the acidity of the stomach besides those 2 tips?
Yeah, absolutely. You would have to first look at the root causes too. So before going into kind of the things that we do, the common root causes can be stress. Again, like I said, going back to, okay, why is my stomach not producing stomach acid? Why do I not have good digestive enzymes? Well, are you under a lot of stress? Is your body chronically ill? Do you have external stressors like family, job? If your body's in a state of fight or flight most of the time, that's going to be a root cause. So of course, I can't say all the other things that we would do in this case without addressing stress and making sure that you're taking care of your nervous system. But the other couple of things that we would look at is a lack of stomach acid. So is your body not producing enough stomach acid? So in that case, we would start you on a supplement called Betaine or hydrochloric acid, and you would take that right before a meal. And that would help boost the stomach acid content in the body, and the food that you eat will now have this nice acid bath and be able to digest and assimilate the nutrients. The other thing too is the pancreas is what secretes a lot of the digestive enzymes, specifically lipase is to break down fats. And so what we would do is start on some digestive enzymes. So you can your body makes digestive enzymes, but you can supplement with them for the short term to help you digest better. And I put a lot of my clients on digestive enzymes because most people that are chronically ill are dealing with some level of breakdown in their digestion. And then keep in mind with the betaine and with the stomach or with the digestive enzymes, those are only for a short period of time. You shouldn't have to be on those indefinitely. These are great supplements to use to stimulate your digestion and then remind your body of how this works. And ideally, you can come off of those. Another approach that I use is an old remedy called digestive bitters. Bitters.
Tell me about those.
Yeah. So they're an herbal tincture. And when the name suits it, okay, because it is very bitter when you taste it. Basically, it's like people have been doing bitters since the beginning of time, I feel like. But when you take those by mouth by a tincture, they do the same thing as like maybe the apple cider vinegar and lemon would. It would help your body secrete its own stomach acid. It would just kind of jumpstart your digestive process. Whereas taking betaine and enzymes is going to replace your body's stomach acid and enzymes.
That makes sense. Okay. So you were talking about the gallbladder. And my first thought was, well, what if they don't have a gallbladder? Because we've had several Zivli members who don't have a gallbladder. And what's your recommendation for digesting fats properly without a gallbladder?
Yes, this is a big, big deal. If you can keep your gallbladder, keep it. I am on a mission to save the gallbladders, okay? We've got to save the gallbladders because people have issues after having a cholecystectomy and they no longer have a gallbladder, despite perhaps what might be told to them by their doctor, because it's a long-term consequence to a short-term issue that can be resolved without having to go that far. I just want to put that out there, because when you no longer have a gallbladder, so the whole role of the gallbladder is it sits underneath the liver, and the liver produces bile, and bile contains things that your body has detoxified. It contains cholesterol, fatty acids, all kinds of things like that. And what it does is it goes and it sits in the gallbladder. So the gallbladder has a really important purpose, okay? It sits underneath the liver and it collects all of this bile. When you eat food, specifically fatty food, you have a messenger called cholecystokinin, or CKK, that is basically released and stimulated to the gallbladder that's holding all this bile. And it says, CKK says, hey, we have fat, and the gallbladder says, okay, let's digest it. And it releases bile in the presence of the fat, okay? Bile gobbles up the fat, and it takes the fat and helps it absorb. I don't know if you know this, but we absorb a lot of the fat through the lymphatic system. So it helps us absorb the fat, and we need fat to build. Every single cell is surrounded in a fatty phospholipid bilayer. So we need good fats, okay? What happens when you don't have a gallbladder is you no longer have that sac that's sitting there filling up with bile that releases bile when there's fat. So now you just have constant bile dripping from the liver. So the liver is always like just dropping bile. So that can be an issue. And you also now don't have enough bile when you eat a fatty meal. So you don't have, it's just not appropriate. The bile release is not appropriate to what you're eating. And so now when you eat a fatty meal, you don't have enough bile to really deal with the fat that you're eating, and you're going to feel bloated and gross. And so with people who've had their gallbladder out, they really more than likely will need to be on bile salts, which is a way to kind of modulate or thin the bile to support the bile flow indefinitely, because there's really that need for the best bile function that we can possibly have in digestion without the use of the gallbladder, who has a specific time to release the bile. You no longer have that. And the bile salts that I use are ox bile, or Biotics research has one called Beta Plus and Beta TCP. Those are two. And then I also use Cellcore Biosciences has advanced TUDCA. TUDCA is something that bodybuilders have been using for a long time to protect the liver and the gallbladder. And so a lot of doctors in functional medicine have seen it really improve bile flow. And so that's also something that I use a lot in my practice. And it helps when you take one, and you'll see that the client has less bloating and symptoms and things like that.
Interesting. Okay. And I'll have you email me like whatever kind of product recommendations that you have. And then we'll link those up in the show notes on the blog post for this episode for people that want to explore some of those options or run them by the doctor. Now, that's another good question. So you're talking about a lot of supplements. Do we need to be running these by primary care physicians before they start taking them? What's your recommendation there?
With supplements, you don't need to. You need to be working with a like certified professional, as far as like a nutritional therapy practitioner like myself, or somebody that really knows supplements. Supplements also are things you can get on your own. I would say just educate yourself the most, but you would definitely, I don't think with something like this, it's really anything that you need to talk to your primary care provider. In fact, a lot of, and myself as a nurse, when I worked in the medical system, we didn't know a lot about digestion. So they may look at you like, what are you talking about? What is TUDCA? What is you want stomach acid? I prescribe antacids. So, so it may not be a great conversation, but if you have an open doctor and you have, that kind of go back and forth with your doctor, then you might bring it up. But I would say work with somebody who knows these supplements well. That would be a good place to go.
Right. Yep. And I would always, because I don't have the practice authority to like tell someone to like, oh, I'm going to prescribe you this. So I always have to say like, you have to run it by your prescribing provider. But yeah, it depends on, I think, the practice autonomy that someone has.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's a really good conversation on the gallbladder. What about the liver? What can we do to support the liver, which is our primary detoxification organ? If we don't have a healthy liver, man, that really sets us up for some liver insulin resistance, which can kind of turn systemic in a hurry. So absolutely. I have like off the top of my head, I'm like, well, drink less and eat less fructose. Because both of those can really contribute to a fatty liver. But what can you advise us on how can we be mindful of the liver when considering gut health?
Yes, I love that you ask about this because we think of the liver as detoxification, but it also does play into the gut as far as being what secretes the bile and all of that. And so, yes, for the liver, there's so much you can do. First, you can start, like you said, limiting sugar, refined carbohydrates, fructose, high fructose corn syrup. And remember, fructose is in a lot of fruit. So you may see high fructose corn syrup on the label, but when you're eating different fruits and things like that that are higher in fructose, those are going to be, over time damaging to the liver. The other thing is increase your liver supporting foods. These are going to be your leafy green vegetables, your cruciferous vegetables like broccoli, cauliflower, beets. Beets are another thing too for thinning bile. So some people really do great with just doing beets every day to help thin the bile. The other couple of things that you can do, I'm a huge fan of castor oil packs. Have you heard of castor oil packs? Do you know anything about them?
I looked into it when I was breastfeeding Leah, I think, or when I was pregnant. I looked into it for some reason related to pregnancy or breastfeeding, but I don't remember why. And I may have gotten some, but I don't remember what I used it for. It's kind of a blurry, the blurry phase of life.
That's a very blurry time. Yeah, so castor oil, basically a castor oil pack is where you pour castor oil in a pack, you put a heating pad over that, put it over the liver, and this absorbs into the skin and into the liver, and it can help upregulate bile flow. It can increase immune cells to the liver, and it really just helps upregulate liver function. A couple of things about castor oil packs is don't use them if you're menstruating, and don't use them if you're pregnant. So those are two big things, but that can really support both phase 1 and phase 2 of liver detoxification. The other few things, so as far as supplements or herbs or things like that, milk thistle has been a long-standing liver support, but I never really use milk thistle by itself. I use Quicksilver Scientific has a supplement called Liver Sauce. It has milk thistle in it, but it also has other things to help support liver detoxification. Things like diindole methane, which can help support detoxification of estrogen, that's a whole other topic, but estrogen really plays a role here too, as far as like what's happening in the gut and all of that. If we could just get into all the topics, we'd be here forever.
Multi-part episode, because you have a lot of great information to share, and I love that you just break it down and like let's just tell people about gut health, and me too. Like I'm learning a lot too. So the castor oil packs for the liver, I'm trying to think of I'm going through the anatomy in my head. Anything else on the liver, things that we can do to support the liver? Because I know I'm going to have to go back and re-listen to this,
right,
so that I can kind of absorb what you're saying again regarding what are the nutrients. Oh, I know I had a question. You might not know this answer. I don't know this answer. I haven't looked it up because quite frankly, I don't want to hear what I'm afraid that I'm going to hear. Okay. So for cruciferous vegetables like broccoli, cauliflower, those Brussels sprouts, does it matter if they're cooked or not in how they support the liver and how the nutrients affect the body?
There are a lot of things that play into that, whether there's some of those foods contain goitrogens, and goitrogenic foods are foods that you need optimal thyroid function to be able to deal with those foods, broccoli, onions, those things. So there's that thing that could be going on. So if you don't have good thyroid function, you're trying to eat those foods and you get bloating and things like that, you would want to look at the thyroid. But then overarching, should I eat it raw or cooked? I would say, how do you feel when you're eating it raw? How do you feel when you're eating it cooked? And based on how you feel, then that's how you should eat your cruciferous vegetables or any type of vegetables, because everybody's different. So there is no one size fits all. It all kind of depends on thyroid function. There can be some oxalate issues. So with this, I think it's very bio-individual. And so it would depend on what you have going on. But if you feel worse when you eat some raw veggies and that whole thing is going on, but then you cook the veggies and you feel better, then stick with cooking them and work with a practitioner to get to the root of what's actually going on. Again, talking about what we've talked about today, it could be a matter of stomach acid and digestive enzymes. You're just not digesting anything in general. So it really just depends. There's not a one size for everybody.
Okay, well, I'm happy to hear that because we really like roasted vegetables, and I wouldn't want to eat like raw Brussels sprouts. So
I know. I don't think anybody likes raw Brussels sprouts. But,
no. Okay, so I'm working down my mental anatomy here. We've covered a lot. We've covered the pancreas. Anything specifically that you wanted to talk related to pancreatic enzymes? Obviously, keeping the just like the liver, like keeping the sugar low, keeping the need for the insulin release low, but that's not really digestive. It does have the digestive enzymes. Anything specific that you can speak to for pancreatic support?
Yes, but first let me go back to liver because there were a couple of other supplements that are important for liver support because they might want to hear. Phosphatidylcholine is important. B vitamins are very important for the liver, and proper protein. Protein, amino acids, you need. We are protein deficient, as you know, because you talk about quite a bit. Zivli is where I learned a lot about that. As a nutritionist, didn't pay attention until I took Zivli, like how protein deficient we really are. We're just not getting enough protein. And when you look at liver detoxification, phase 1 and phase 2, you see the need for amino acids. And so good protein, something as simple as making sure you're getting enough protein, is going to be helpful for the liver. I think that's kind of, I just wanted to make sure I got those in before we moved on. But yeah, so the pancreas is going to support, as we know, secrete insulin in the presence of glucose, but then also lipase is going to be really important. And so when you take a lot of digestive enzymes, will have lipase in them. So I use a very broad digestive enzyme in my practice. I use a couple. I use Intenzyme, Forte, and I also use Enzymix Pro by Apex Energetics. And so those are going to be very broad spectrum and contain lipase. And as far as like the pancreas, there's not a lot that we really do to like, hey, support your pancreas. It mainly just comes down to don't overwork it with high refined carbs, high sugar, where insulin is just those islet cells in the pancreas start to get overwhelmed when you're insulin resistant and you're just completely constantly spurting out insulin. So I would say the best thing you can do to support your pancreas is get your refined carbohydrates and sugar down, bring your insulin down, and that's going to help take off the burden of that. And then for a digestive purpose, if you need that support with breaking down and assimilating fats, then making sure your lipase is good.
Okay, that was such good information. Like all of this is so good. A really helpful conversation, I think. Okay, so moving on, we're moving down the duodenum. I know the question that has been like, I'm dying to know your opinion on this. So I just finished Metabolical by Dr. Robert Lustig. In it, he said something that was like a knife to my heart. And it was like, if you put, fiber or whatever in smoothies, it really crushes up the insoluble fiber, and it does not have the same health benefits regarding slowing the absorption of nutrients because it loses the structural integrity that provides the lattice work. I talked about that in a YouTube video recently. But then I'm like, well, what about chewing my food? Like, isn't that just like making a smoothie in my mouth? Or is it just, the particles are still bigger when I swallow them?
Is he talking about, did you say soluble or insoluble fiber?
Insoluble.
So he's saying to limit it because in the small intestine. So repeat that again. Sorry.
Okay. So he's saying if you put foods that contain insoluble fiber into a smoothie and you blend it up, you ruin the structural integrity of the insoluble fiber. And if you ruin the structural integrity of the insoluble fiber, it doesn't provide the barrier to the gut to slow the absorption of the nutrients for a lower blood sugar and insulin response. And that was really hard for me because I do a lot of smoothies. And I was like, oh man, I can't give myself as much credit as I thought for these smoothies. What is your opinion on, like the insoluble fiber issue?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I see why you're asking, well, if I chew, am I not doing the same thing? And that's a good point. So I would say, I'm not sure. I know you talked about that book and I actually have it on my list because I do want to read it. I do know that with insoluble fiber is great in a sense that it's not going to get broken down as much. And so it's going to serve as kind of like, think of something coming along and just pushing things through your digestive tract. So if you're having issues with having bowel movements, increasing insoluble fiber is going to be helpful there. As far as breaking down the fiber to where it's not able to be used, that's interesting because I'm not sure, but what I will say is soluble fiber. So the opposite of insoluble fiber is soluble fiber. It gets broken down by the gut bugs that we've talked about in this podcast. It's going to be soluble in water and it's going to get fermented by the gut bugs that are in the gut. And so that one can get broken down. But my understanding of insoluble fiber, and I could be wrong, is it doesn't get broken down. There are no gut bugs that can go and, latch onto it, break it down, and it goes through intact and pushes.
That's my understanding as well. Yeah. So it's like, well, how small can insoluble fiber get before it's not helpful? I don't know.
Maybe we need a microscope and see. So I would just be interested to learn more about what he's saying. So I definitely need to read that book. Another side note about soluble fiber is when you eat soluble fiber, so think flaxseed, chia seeds, when you eat soluble fiber, it is awesome. You have good gut bugs that are going to break it down. And what's going to happen is there's going to be a byproduct called short chain fatty acids. And those actually are like free energy. So this is really important for your audience because everybody's wondering about blood sugar and energy and metabolism and all that. And so short chain fatty acids are able to be used by the mitochondria to create energy. And so you're not getting this glucose and insulin spike. You're almost kind of cheating the system when you eat soluble fiber. You can get an energy source from that. So I didn't know if you knew that. I thought that was pretty interesting. I'm a huge fan of soluble fiber.
And the short chain fatty acids are also anti-inflammatory. So that's another benefit of that. Okay, so I know that we have probably 15-ish minutes left, I believe. And I wanted to talk about anything specific to support the small intestine and the colon and the large intestine. And then we had a question from a Zivli member that I wanted to be sure that we got to. And then we kind of began this conversation about like talking about how do antibiotics affect it. I think that you kind of touched on that. And then we kind of dove into more of like an anatomical review and which I think is so beneficial for people to appreciate all of the different aspects that go from like one hole to the other on digestion and absorption. So anything specific that you wanted to add to the small and large intestine?
Yes. So with the small and large intestine, now remember, we've supported upper GI first. We've supported digestion, acid, enzymes, all of the functioning in the liver, gallbladder. Now we're down to the small and large intestine. What can we do? And this is often what people do first. So a lot of people will be familiar with some of these things, but when you've done it in the right order, now we're going to work on supporting the small and large intestine. So we're going to start with a good spore-based probiotic. What is a spore-based probiotic, and why do I choose spore-based probiotics, and what do all of the probiotics at the health food store mean? What are colony forming units, CFUs? What is all of that? A spore-based probiotic is a probiotic that is encapsulated in a spore. And in that spore, it's protected from the acid in the stomach. So if you think about, I'm going to take a probiotic and I'm going to swallow it. First, it's going to go to the stomach where what do you have in the stomach? You have acid in the stomach. So guess what? Those microorganisms in that probiotic, they're going to die. They're not going to make it to the large intestine to re-inoculate the gut. So you want to choose a good spore-based probiotic because it survives the harsh environment of the stomach and makes it to the large intestine to support the microbiome. My go-to is Megaspore by Microbiome Labs. I also like Just Thrive, and Cell4 has one called CT Biotic. Those are going to be spore-based probiotics. So forget the overwhelm as you go to the store and you see how many CFUs. If your probiotic has to be refrigerated, it's not a good probiotic because you're going to refrigerate it and take good care of it, but then it's going to hit the acid in your stomach and it's going to die. So to support lower GI, the microbiome, first thing is a good spore-based probiotic. And then you want a prebiotic. So you can do this by doing prebiotic foods, but I like Microbiome Labs prebiotic. I use it a lot in my practice. And what a prebiotic does is it is going to feed the good guys. So say you had antibiotics or some sort of infection, your bad guys have all been killed, but still have your good guys. Not only is the probiotic going to increase the number of your good guys, now we're going to do the prebiotic that's going to feed those good guys. So we're re-inoculating, getting good guys in the gut. Now we're taking a prebiotic to feed those good guys to keep them strong. And then last, we need mucosal support. So your stomach and your GI tract is lined with a mucosal layer, and that is basically to protect it because I don't know if you've heard of leaky gut. That's something that we talk a lot about. Leaky gut is when the lining of your stomach becomes loose and things are traveling through from the stomach into the bloodstream, causes an immune reaction. And this is where we sometimes see autoimmunity and things like that because the junctions, the cells that line the GI tract are just loose and things are getting through that shouldn't. And so if you have inflammation, really look at the gut. But a mucosal support, something like Mega Mucosa from Microbiome Labs is what I use a lot to help go in and seal up those tight junctions to support the mucosal layer. So that way the stomach has that defense against the stomach acid and defense against other irritants that might be in the gut, and really going in and sealing that. And so you'd want to work with a practitioner to do kind of that full on protocol. But some things you can do on your own is really get more, get some bone broth. That's going to be one of the easiest things. Like, you want good collagen rich, you want glycine, amino acids. Those are all going to really help. Humic and fulvic minerals, you can get some mineral droppers. Those are going to help seal up the leaky gut. And then you want to, after you've done all of that, you've got to look at parasitic infections. And, you know, there's a lot of different parasites that can hang out in the lower, lower GI. That can be the reason why some people aren't getting better from other things, because the immune system is busy dealing with parasitic infections that it can't really get to. And to not get too in the nerdy weeds, but there's the Th1 and the Th2 immune system. When there are parasitic infections present, the Th1 and Th2 immune system becomes unbalanced. And so the analogy I like to use there is, if you're a mom and you have 2 kids and you have one kid that requires a lot of your attention, when you're busy with that kid, the other kid doesn't really have the support, and it causes problems everywhere, right? So that's your Th1 and yeah. The immune system is the mom, and the Th1 and the Th2 need to be balanced. But when there's parasitic infections, the immune system is really busy on keeping those in check. So then we have other chronic illnesses like Epstein-Barr, Lyme, we can have mold issues, all those other things that cause people to be sick. So all of that to say that parasitic infections are extremely important and need to be addressed after you've kind of worked on healing the gut and all of that, and making sure that there's not parasitic infections or opportunistic infections like yeast and candida. Those need to be specifically targeted.
Okay. And then I think my last question specifically for this are just natural foods. So not supplements, but there's just some foods that are high in prebiotics and probiotics, if you know of any specific ones that you can share.
Yes. So probiotic foods are going to include anything that's going to be fermented. So sauerkraut, kimchi, yogurt, and be careful with yogurt because yogurt can be really sugary. And I like coconut yogurt. It's a really, there's a brand called Cocoyo that has a really good coconut yogurt, because you don't want to eat yogurt that's full of sugar, because now you're going to feed those gut bugs, and you're also going to have blood sugar dysregulation, which is all that Zivli and you're about, Dr. Morgan, is balancing the blood sugar. So we don't want to just be eating yogurt and things like that. And kombucha, which is another great fermented drink that can help support the gut. But unfortunately, so much kombucha contains sugar. I can't find a good one. So you're helping restore your microbiome with this kombucha, but like you're now feeding the yeast. So it cancels itself out, I think. Those are the foods I would say stick with. And then again, I can't speak enough on protein and amino acids, which segues us into the next question.
Yes, yeah. So I have, let's see, the main question. Do you have it pulled up? I did somewhere. Oh, I have it right here. Okay. So this was from one of our Zivli members in office hours. I said that Ashlee and I were doing an interview, and we, asked if anyone had any questions on gut health. And she said, I've read and heard so much about plant-based being the healthiest for gut. I keep reading that all animal products mess up the gut. What is your opinion on this? I am dairy intolerant, so I have to keep that very low in my diet. But what about meat, fish, and eggs?
I love this question. I hit this question head on probably every initial consult with my clients. Yeah, because there's a little bit of misunderstanding. It's not that the protein sources or the animal meats that you're eating are bad for digestion. It's that perhaps you don't have the digestive function that we've talked about today to support when you do eat, let's say, a steak or some ground beef. You're going to eat it and you're going to feel awful, because it's not that the food's doing it, it's that your body's not set up to tolerate it. So the food gets the bad, it's the guilty, it's the innocent party at the crime scene, right? It's not the food, it's the environment that food has to work in. And protein sources, most of which are, the meat, animal-based sources, are going to take a little bit more effort to digest. So I'm not negating that. That's absolutely true. It's going to be harder to digest. A lot of the science that comes out kind of giving the animal-based protein sources a bad rap comes from this understanding of when you cook meat and you burn it. So if you ever eat charred meat, that black charry stuff that can happen in your meat, what those create are advanced glycation molecules that can cause inflammation and lead to cancer and things like that. So I'm a big fan of, I think this gets clumped into this overarching thing of don't eat meat. I would just say don't burn your meat. If you see that you have that burnt meat, the AGEs that are there, that's going to cause problems. Yes, it's going to cause problems with digestion. It can cause problems with just your immune system and keeping yourself healthy. So don't burn the meat, but don't unfortunately let that fall into that umbrella that the eating meat or animal-based protein is going to be a problem. The other thing I'll say is there's so many gut healing properties of animal-based protein, that all the amino acids that we've talked about, how, glycine, making sure you're getting collagen, all those things are going to come from animal-rich, protein-rich animal sources. And then like butter and things like that, that's the fats that you're going to get are going to be so healthy for the body as well. So you really want good fats, and most of the vegetable seed oils are going to be inflammatory and cause problems in the body. So the good fats, saturated fats that you can get from animal-based products are going to be healthy for every single cell in the body. So my approach is a little bit different. I'm a big believer in animal-based protein quality source, right? You want grass-fed beef, you want Atlantic wild-caught salmon. I see clients that come to me that are, vegan, vegetarian, and we segue them into an animal-based diet, and they do really well. And a lot of times when you're doing you're not eating animal protein, you're at risk for anemia, B vitamin deficiencies, protein deficiencies, and things like that.
Yep. And that's kind of my thought too, is I think we've really done a nice job today outlining there's benefits of both. Like there's benefits of animal, but then you have the insoluble and the soluble fiber. And we talked about the probiotic, rich foods, some of which are plants, some of which are animals. And so I think it really goes back to what's the quality, what's your, and like, what's the environment in which the food is being digested? Is there some work that needs to be done there? So I think you did a nice job answering that. And I know that we haven't touched on a couple medications. So we have the antidepressants, which we wanted to touch on as it relates to like weight gain and all the sorts of stuff like that, and your personal story, which is going to be my favorite part of this. So we'll have you back for part 3, but before we wrap this part up, is there anything else that you wanted to share as it relates to digestive health, antibiotics, how all that impacts weight loss? I know, we touched on inflammation, which can obviously raise insulin and hamper weight loss, but anything else that you kind of wanted to throw in here to button up this section?
Yeah, I think the main thing, there is one thing I didn't mention when I was talking about spore-based probiotics, and that is that they can be taken concurrently with antibiotics. So if for some reason, there's a time and a place for antibiotics, they are needed. Sometimes you don't have to wait until after your antibiotic to take a spore-based probiotic. So you can be healing the gut, re-inoculating the gut while you're taking an antibiotic when you're taking a spore-based probiotic like the ones I talked about. So I didn't mention that, which is really cool, because I know a lot of people have anxiety when they know they need to take an antibiotic for whatever reason. And I'm like, we can work on the gut while you're doing it. So that's really super helpful. And the other thing I would say is if anything overwhelmed you, I feel like we talked about a lot.
Yes, I loved it.
Yeah. If any of it overwhelmed you, you can turn the video on to slow mode, and you can rewind and watch it again. But you can go to my website, ashleesymcox.com. I have an upper GI optimization module. It's like 17 minutes. You can go enroll into that. And it explains all this a little bit more in depth. And then I would say work with a practitioner. If you're overwhelmed and you're like, well, crap, I don't even know where to start. There are functional nutritional therapy practitioners are amazing. This is what we do every day. Reach out, find somebody in your area to work with somebody to help you with this, because there's a lot of moving parts when it comes to digestion and gut health. So
I think the thing too that's really helpful about like working with someone like you is the pattern recognition. So you mentioned something earlier about thyroid, and like, oh, if you eat this and you have bloating, that could be a thyroid issue.
Right.
Like people don't just know that unless they have the pattern and the experience and have worked with other people with the thyroid issues. So I think that if you're having some gut issues, I hope that this episode kind of opened your eyes that a probiotic is, especially one that goes in the fridge, is not the answer.
Right. Throw it out, throw it away.
Your money. And so I think hopefully we've opened their eyes to say, oh, like maybe there's hope for me because this probiotic wasn't working and I'm having all these gut symptoms. And now I'm hopeful that, there's like 10 steps in this process that I can optimize. And that's the whole goal here, is just to educate the community that gut health is so much, it's like such a small little thing, gut health, but it's like actually a huge scope. So thank you for sharing your expertise with us. This was a really great episode.
Awesome. Well, it was an honor to share, and thank you again for having me again.
Yeah, we'll see you on part 3.
Okay, great. Bye.
Bye.